In 1932, an expedition disappeared into one of the most unforgiving jungles on Earth. 23 men crossed the last inhabited village and were never seen again. No bodies, no camp, no abandoned equipment. Weeks later, a single man emerged from the jungle, starving, feverish, and barely able to speak. What he claimed had happened was so unbelievable that many dismissed him as insane. Yet decades later, newly uncovered evidence forced historians to reconsider everything. This is the story of the expedition that entered the jungle and why only one man came back. Few places on Earth inspire as much fascination and fear as the great tropical rainforests of South America. Endless rivers, towering trees that block the sunlight, poisonous insects, hidden predators, and landscapes so vast that a person can disappear forever just a few miles from civilization. For centuries, explorers entered these forests searching for lost cities, ancient civilizations, unimaginable riches, or simply the thrill of mapping the unknown. Some returned with incredible discoveries. Others never returned at all. Among those forgotten stories is one that has puzzled historians for generations. It began as a carefully organized scientific expedition, supported by experienced explorers who believed they had prepared for every danger the jungle could offer. They carried maps, supplies, medical equipment, firearms, experienced guides, and enough confidence to believe that discipline and planning could overcome nature itself. The mission seemed straightforward. Cross the unexplored region, document the geography, search for archaeological remains rumored to exist beyond the last known settlements, and return within 3 months with information that could change what the world knew about that mysterious corner of the continent. The first weeks went exactly as planned. Regular reports reached nearby settlements. Native guides described the expedition as disciplined and optimistic. Supplies were carefully rationed. Morale remained high. Nothing suggested that disaster was approaching. Then the letters stopped. Weeks became months. Search parties followed their route only to discover abandoned camps, extinguished fires, broken equipment, and trails that suddenly vanished into untouched wilderness. There were no signs of violence, no mass graves, no obvious explanation. It was as if the jungle itself had erased every trace of the expedition. Authorities eventually declared every member missing and presumed dead. The case slowly faded into obscurity, until one morning, months after the disappearance, a lone figure staggered out of the forest, thin beyond recognition, covered in scars, barely able to stand. He was one of the explorers, the only one who ever came back. And according to his story, the jungle was never their greatest enemy. The story begins in the early 1930s, when much of the world's largest rainforests still remain blank spaces on official maps. From the perspective of modern satellite imagery, it is difficult to imagine that entire valleys, rivers, and mountain ranges were once completely unknown to science. Yet, for the explorers of that era, there were still places where no documented expedition had ever returned with reliable information. Governments wanted maps. Museums wanted artifacts. Universities wanted discoveries. Newspapers wanted heroes. And wealthy sponsors wanted their names forever connected to history. Among the men driven by that ambition was Professor Arthur Bennett, a respected geographer in his early 50s whose reputation had been built through years of careful fieldwork rather than reckless adventure. He believed that every unexplored region represented a missing chapter in humanity's understanding of the planet. Unlike treasure hunters chasing myths of gold, Bennett wanted evidence, measurements, sketches, photographs, botanical samples, and archaeological records. He often repeated that the greatest discoveries were not always made by the bravest men, but by the most patient ones. Months before the expedition departed, Bennett and his team worked inside crowded libraries, military archives, and missionary records, searching for every fragment of information available. Old Portuguese journals described abandoned stone structures hidden beyond rivers that no longer appeared on maps. Rubber traders mentioned enormous carved pillars swallowed by vines. Indigenous elders spoke cautiously about valleys where outsiders entered but rarely returned. Some stories contradicted one another. Others sounded impossible. Yet a surprising number pointed toward the same isolated region, a section of dense jungle almost completely absent from official surveys. The expedition gradually took shape. It would consist of 23 men, each selected for a specific purpose. There were surveyors responsible for mapping the terrain, botanists collecting unknown plant species, photographers carrying fragile cameras protected inside wooden cases, physicians prepared to treat tropical diseases, engineers capable of repairing equipment in the field, experienced hunters, radio operators, and several local guides who knew the rivers better than anyone else. Every member understood that this would not be a comfortable scientific journey. It would be a test of endurance lasting months. Preparation consumed nearly a year. Hundreds of kilograms of supplies were carefully packed into waterproof crates. Preserved food, medicines, rope, climbing equipment, tents, ammunition, replacement boots, fuel, navigation instruments, notebooks sealed against humidity, and enough photographic film to document every significant discovery. Every kilogram mattered. Anything unnecessary could become a burden after weeks of marching through mud, flooded forests, and steep hillsides. Before departure, Bennett gathered the entire team for one final briefing. Standing before an enormous hand-drawn map, covered with penciled notes, he reminded everyone that confidence could become more dangerous than the jungle itself. He warned them that exhaustion often caused experienced explorers to make fatal mistakes. Rivers change direction after heavy rain. Trails disappeared overnight. A single infected cut could become life-threatening within days. The rainforest rewarded discipline and punished arrogance. On the morning of departure, relatives filled the railway platform to say goodbye. Wives embraced husbands a little longer than usual. Children waved enthusiastically, believing their fathers would soon return with stories of colorful birds and mysterious ruins. Reporters photographed the smiling expedition members standing beside crates stamped with the insignia of the Geographical Society, financing the mission. Newspapers described the journey as one of the most ambitious scientific expeditions ever attempted in that part of the continent. Few imagined those photographs would later become the last images of almost everyone standing in them. The team traveled for weeks before reaching the final settlement connected to the outside world. It was a small frontier village where supplies could still be purchased and letters could still be delivered. Beyond that point, there would be no roads, no telegraph lines, no permanent settlements, and no certainty that help could arrive if something went wrong. The expedition spent several days reorganizing equipment, hiring additional canoe operators, and speaking with local residents who knew the surrounding wilderness better than any official map ever could. Many conversations ended the same way. The villagers gladly described rivers, waterfalls, hunting grounds, and seasonal floods. But whenever Bennett unfolded his map and pointed toward the unexplored region farther inland, the mood changed noticeably. Some men quietly shook their heads. Others refused to answer at all. A few elderly residents simply advised the explorers to choose another route. They did not speak of monsters or supernatural forces. Instead, they repeated something far more unsettling. The jungle beyond those rivers was different. Travelers entered it normally, but those who managed to return were never the same. Bennett listened respectfully but remained unconvinced. Throughout history, every unexplored place had eventually accumulated frightening legends. Fear often grew where reliable information did not exist. He thanked the villagers, paid the guides, sealed his journals inside waterproof cases, folded the final version of the expedition map, and prepared to leave at sunrise. Behind him remained the last place where the world still knew exactly where they were. Ahead stretched thousands of square miles of wilderness capable of hiding anything, and anyone, forever. At dawn, the expedition left the village in complete silence. The excitement that filled the railway station weeks earlier had given way to concentration. From that moment on, every decision could determine whether they would eventually return home or disappear into the endless green maze ahead. The narrow river became their first road, its dark waters reflecting a sky almost hidden beneath towering trees. The air was heavy with humidity, and even before sunrise, sweat soaked through their clothes. The first days passed with surprising ease. The local guides navigated the winding waterways with remarkable confidence, recognizing subtle bends, fallen trees, and changes in the current that seemed invisible to everyone else. Camps were established before sunset, meals were carefully rationed, and Bennett insisted that every observation be recorded. Botanists cataloged unfamiliar plants. Photographers captured towering saber trees draped in vines, and surveyors measured distances with meticulous precision. Everything suggested that the expedition was progressing exactly as planned. Wildlife surrounded them constantly. Scarlet macaws crossed the sky in noisy flocks. Monkeys watched silently from high branches, and colorful butterflies filled the humid air like drifting petals. Yet beneath that extraordinary beauty lay constant reminders that the rainforest tolerated no mistakes. Venomous snakes disappeared beneath fallen leaves without a sound. Tiny insects left painful bites that quickly became infected. Heavy afternoon storms transformed dry paths into rivers of thick mud within minutes. Every kilometer demanded patience. As the days passed, the jungle gradually changed. The familiar animal sounds became less frequent, replaced by an almost unsettling stillness that several members quietly noticed. Even the experienced guides spoke less than before. They no longer joked around a campfire or pointed out landmarks with the same confidence. Instead, they often exchanged brief glances among themselves, as though silently confirming something they preferred not to discuss. One afternoon, the expedition reached an abandoned riverside camp. At first glance, it appeared to have been used only weeks earlier. A rusted cooking pot rested beside an extinguished fire pit. Fragments of broken crates lay scattered across the clearing. A hammock hung between two trees, torn but still swaying gently in the breeze. There were no signs of violence, no human remains, and no indication of where its occupants had gone. Bennett carefully examined every object, concluding that another expedition or group of traders had likely passed through long ago. Still, he found it strange that valuable tools had been left behind. That evening, one of the younger surveyors admitted he had the uneasy feeling that someone had been watching them throughout the day. Others laughed politely, suggesting that exhaustion and unfamiliar surroundings often played tricks on the mind. Bennett agreed. Isolation, he reminded them, could amplify ordinary fears until they felt completely real. Nevertheless, he quietly doubled the night watches, explaining that caution was always preferable to confidence. The following morning revealed something even more curious. During the night, dozens of footprints had appeared around the edge of the camp. They were human, barefoot, and of different sizes, as though several people had quietly circled the tents while everyone slept. Yet the guards insisted they had neither seen nor heard anyone. There were no footprints leading toward the camp and none leading away. They simply began at the muddy edge of the clearing and disappeared again a few meters later where the ground became covered with leaves. The guides became visibly uncomfortable. One suggested abandoning the planned route altogether, arguing that there were safer waterways farther east. Another refused to explain his concern, but asked Bennett to reconsider the mission while there was still time to turn back. Bennett listened patiently before making his decision. He respected their experience, but no scientific expedition could change course every time it encountered an unexplained event. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps an isolated indigenous group had observed them during the night and intentionally concealed their tracks. Until evidence suggested otherwise, that remained the most reasonable conclusion. The expedition resumed its journey before noon. As the canoes disappeared around the next bend in the river, none of the men noticed a small wooden carving hanging from a nearby tree. It had been hidden beneath vines, almost invisible unless viewed from a particular angle. Years later, search teams would discover the same carving still suspended there, weathered by rain but unmistakably deliberate. No one could identify who had placed it there, or why it marked the exact point where the expedition left the last region that would ever be accurately mapped. The expedition had now been traveling for nearly 3 weeks. According to Bennett's calculations, they were making excellent progress. The terrain had been more forgiving than expected. Supplies remained sufficient, and the team had already documented dozens of plant species that had never been formally cataloged. Spirits were high, and several members privately believed the expedition would become one of the greatest scientific successes of the decade. Every evening followed the same disciplined routine. Camps were established before darkness fell. Fires were built only where the canopy allowed smoke to escape. Equipment was cleaned, boots were dried as well as possible, journals were updated, and the physician inspected every man for cuts, insect bites, or early signs of tropical disease. Bennett insisted that small problems be solved immediately, reminding everyone that in the jungle, Minor inconveniences often became fatal emergencies. The only growing concern was navigation. The maps they had carried from civilization were becoming less useful with each passing day. Rivers frequently divided into several narrow channels before joining again miles later. Hills appeared where none had been recorded. Valleys extended much farther than expected. More than once, the surveyors concluded that existing charts contained errors of several miles. It became increasingly clear that they were entering territory that almost no outsider had documented with precision. One afternoon, they encountered the first indigenous settlement since leaving the frontier village. Unlike previous communities, its inhabitants showed little curiosity toward the newcomers. Men, women, and children observed the expedition from a distance without approaching. No one smiled. No one waved. An elderly man eventually stepped forward after speaking quietly with several others. Through one of the guides, he agreed to exchange fresh fruit and smoked fish for tools and salt. Bennett hoped the meeting would provide valuable geographical information. He unfolded his map, pointed toward the region farther west, and politely asked whether there were rivers or mountains beyond the next valley. The old man studied the map for several seconds without saying a word. Then he slowly shook his head. Instead of answering the question, he asked one of his own, "Why do you wish to go where no one lives?" Bennett explained that the expedition was searching for evidence of ancient settlements and wished to improve existing maps. The interpreter carefully translated every sentence. Again, the old man remained silent. Finally, he raised one weathered hand and pointed toward the dense forest beyond the village. "People once lived there," he said quietly. "Long ago. What happened to them?" Bennett asked. The old man looked away before replying. "They forgot how to leave." The answer puzzled everyone. Bennett assumed something had been lost during translation and asked for clarification, but the elder simply repeated the same sentence. They forgot how to leave. No one offered further explanation. The meeting ended politely, but the atmosphere had changed. As the expedition prepared to continue, several villagers quietly placed small bundles of dried herbs inside the canoes without asking for payment. One of the guides immediately recognized the plants. They were traditionally carried for protection during dangerous journeys through isolated forests. When Bennett asked why, the guide hesitated before answering. They believed some places should never be entered without asking permission. Permission from whom? Bennett asked. The guide avoided the question. From the forest. Bennett smiled politely but dismissed the explanation. Throughout history, every culture had developed beliefs to explain the dangers surrounding them. To him, those rituals reflected respect for nature rather than evidence of anything supernatural. He thanked the villagers for their generosity and ordered the expedition to move forward before the afternoon rains arrived. Less than 2 hours later, the weather changed with astonishing speed. Dark clouds swallowed the sunlight. A violent storm erupted almost instantly, flooding narrow trails and forcing the expedition to seek higher ground. Trees bent under powerful winds. Thunder rolled across the valley without pause, and visibility dropped to only a few yards. The team struggled to protect their equipment as sheets of rain transformed the jungle floor into flowing mud. The storm lasted well into the night. When dawn finally arrived, the forest looked completely different. Entire trees had fallen across the path. Small streams had become raging rivers. Several landmarks used in navigation had disappeared beneath landslides. But the greatest surprise came when the surveyors attempted to relocate the previous day's route. It was gone. Not damaged. Not blocked. Gone. The trail they had carefully opened through the vegetation no longer existed. Branches had somehow settled back into place. Fresh vines covered sections they had cut only the day before. Leaves concealed nearly every trace of their passage. Even the guide stood in silence. One of them finally whispered words that no one wrote in the official journals. The jungle doesn't want us to remember the way back. The disappearance of the trail forced the expedition to slow its pace for the first time. Until then, Bennett had believed every obstacle could be overcome with patience, accurate measurements, and disciplined planning. But the rainforest seemed determined to prove that maps drawn one day could become useless the next. Fallen trees blocked familiar paths. Swollen rivers erased natural crossings, and dense vegetation reclaimed every opening with astonishing speed. The jungle was not simply difficult to cross. It was constantly rebuilding itself. The surveyors spent the entire morning taking fresh bearings. Using compasses, sextants, and elevation readings, they attempted to match their current position with the previous day's records. The numbers refused to agree. According to their calculations, the expedition should have been standing beside a narrow tributary flowing north. Instead, they faced a much wider river moving in the opposite direction. Bennett personally repeated every measurement. The results remained inconsistent. Assuming the instruments had been damaged by the storm, he ordered every compass to be inspected. To everyone's surprise, all of them appeared perfectly functional. Yet when placed side by side on a flat crate, their needles failed to align. Some pointed slightly northeast. Others drifted west before slowly correcting themselves. The differences were small, but impossible to ignore. For experienced navigators, even a few degrees of error could mean walking miles away from the intended route. The radio operator suggested climbing one of the surrounding hills to establish a better position. After several exhausting hours, a small group reached the summit expecting to see the river they had followed for weeks. Instead, an endless sea of green stretched toward every horizon. Countless treetops merged into a single unbroken canopy with almost no visible landmarks. Every direction looked identical. It was as though the forest had swallowed every point of reference. That evening, Bennett spread the expedition's maps across a wooden crate inside his tent. By lantern light, he compared each page with the latest field notes, carefully correcting river bends, marking newly discovered hills, and adjusting estimated distances. It was tedious work, but accurate maps had always been the foundation of successful exploration. Before sleeping, he folded the papers neatly, placed them inside a waterproof leather case, and set the case beside his bedroll. The following morning, something impossible seemed to have happened. When Bennett reopened the case, several pencil markings no longer matched the notes written only hours earlier. At first, he assumed fatigue had caused him to remember incorrectly, but the surveyors who had helped prepare the map insisted the same thing. A river that had been drawn on the eastern side of a valley now appeared farther south. Elevation notes seemed slightly altered. One entire section looked as though it had been erased and redrawn by another hand. No one accused anyone else of tampering with the documents. There was simply no logical opportunity for it to have happened. The leather case had remained sealed beside Bennett throughout the night. Yet everyone agreed that the map looked different. The incident unsettled even the most skeptical members of the expedition. Some quietly blamed the humidity, suggesting that damp paper had distorted pencil lines. Others believed the exhaustion of recent days was affecting their memory. Bennett accepted the simplest explanation available: human beings. He reminded the group, often remember details differently after periods of stress. Until there was stronger evidence, the map itself should not become a source of fear. Still, a subtle change spread through the camp. Conversations became shorter. Laughter grew less frequent. Men who had once volunteered for scouting patrols now preferred to remain close to the main group. The jungle had begun to affect them in ways that were difficult to measure. It was not simply the insects, the heat, or the constant rain. It was a growing realization that certainty was slowly disappearing. Late that afternoon, the expedition discovered another sign that they were no longer alone. Fresh footprints crossed a muddy riverbank less than half a mile ahead. They clearly belonged to several people traveling barefoot. The prints were recent, perhaps only a few hours old, and led toward the dense forest beyond the water. Excited by the possibility of encountering another indigenous community, Bennett ordered a small reconnaissance team to follow them while the rest of the expedition established camp. The trackers followed the trail for nearly 40 minutes before reaching a small clearing. It was empty. No huts, no campfires, no tools, no signs of recent occupation. The footprints simply ended in the middle of the clearing, as though the people who had made them had vanished without taking another step. The men searched every direction. Nothing, not a single broken branch, not another footprint, only complete silence. When the scouting party returned and described what they had seen, even Bennett struggled to offer an explanation. He finally concluded that heavy leafall or recent rain must have concealed the remaining tracks. It was possible. It was reasonable. Yet as darkness settled over the forest once again, more than one member of the expedition found themselves staring into the black wall of trees surrounding the camp, wondering whether the jungle was hiding people, or whether it was hiding something else entirely. By the fourth week, exhaustion had become a permanent companion. The men no longer complained about the heat or the insects because there was no point. Clothes never completely dried. Boots remained soaked day after day. Every movement required pushing through tangled vines, climbing slippery slopes, or wading across rivers whose depths could change overnight. Even sleeping offered little relief. Strange calls echoed to the darkness. Insects crawled into tents, and sudden rainstorms often forced everyone awake before dawn. Despite the hardships, Bennett refused to shorten the mission. According to his calculations, they were approaching the region described in several 19th century journals. If those old records contained even a fragment of truth, they were closer than anyone had ever been to solving one of the greatest geographical mysteries of the continent. Turning back now would mean abandoning months of preparation and years of anticipation. Not everyone shared his confidence anymore. Private conversations around the evening fires became increasingly cautious. Several men admitted they felt constantly watched, although no one had actually seen another person for days. Others complained of hearing footsteps beyond the edge of the camp at night, always just far enough away to remain invisible. The guards reported no intruders. Yet almost every morning they discovered fresh disturbances in the mud surrounding the tents, small depressions, broken twigs, or patches of flattened vegetation that had not been there the night before. The physician offered a practical explanation. Continuous stress, poor sleep, dehydration, and tropical fatigue could heighten awareness until ordinary forest sounds seemed threatening. He encouraged everyone to rest whenever possible and warned Bennett that fear itself could become contagious if left unchecked. For a short time, his advice appeared to help. Then Samuel Carter disappeared. Carter was one of the expedition's surveyors, a quiet and methodical man, respected for his patience. He was not impulsive, nor was he known for taking unnecessary risks. On the morning of his disappearance, he had breakfast with the rest of the group, joked about finally shaving once they returned to civilization, and spent nearly an hour helping repair one of the damaged canoes. Nothing about his behavior suggested distress. Shortly after noon, he volunteered to collect water from a nearby stream, less than 200 yards from camp. He never returned. At first, no one was alarmed. Delays were common in the rainforest. A fallen tree, difficult terrain, or a brief detour could easily consume an extra hour. But when 2 hours passed without any sign of Carter, Bennett organized a search party. The stream was exactly where it should have been. So was Carter's metal water container. It rested upright on a large rock beside the flowing water, completely full. There were footprints leading from the camp to the stream. There were footprints around the rock where he had filled the container. Then, nothing. No signs of a struggle. No blood. No broken vegetation. No drag marks. No animal tracks. No footprints leading away. It looked as though Carter had simply ceased to exist. The search continued until well after sunset. Lanterns illuminated every inch of the surrounding forest. Men shouted his name until their voices grew hoarse. They searched the riverbanks, climbed nearby ridges, and followed every possible animal trail. Nothing. The following morning, Bennett doubled the search radius. Again, nothing. The disappearance unsettled everyone because it violated every explanation they could imagine. If Carter had been attacked by a predator, there would have been evidence. If he had wandered off while confused, tracks would eventually appear somewhere. If he had deliberately abandoned the expedition, he would have needed food, equipment, and weapons, all of which remained neatly arranged inside his tent. That evening, one of the local guides quietly approached Bennett. He suggested they leave immediately. Not because of Carter, because this was exactly how it always began. When Bennett demanded an explanation, the guide hesitated for several long seconds. In these forests, he finally said, people are not always taken all at once. They disappear one by one. Bennett dismissed the statement as superstition. But for the first time since entering the jungle, his confidence had begun to crack. He could explain storms. He could explain disease, exhaustion, even faulty navigation. He could not explain how a careful, experienced surveyor had vanished beside a shallow stream, without leaving a single step behind. That night, for the first time since the expedition began, Bennett issued an order he had hoped would never become necessary. From that moment forward, no man would ever walk through the jungle alone again. Samuel Carter's disappearance changed the expedition in ways that no one openly admitted. The scientific optimism that had defined the journey slowly gave way to caution. Conversations became quieter, movements more deliberate, and every task was now performed in pairs or small groups. Bennett enforced a new rule without exception. No one would collect water alone. No one would scout ahead alone. No one would even leave camp after sunset without at least two companions. If the jungle wanted to isolate them, they would refuse to be separated. For several days, the new discipline appeared to work. The expedition advanced slowly, carefully marking trees with bright cloth strips and cutting wider paths through the vegetation to make the return journey easier. The surveyors updated their maps whenever possible, while the botanists continued gathering samples despite the growing tension. Bennett hoped routine would restore confidence. Fear, he believed, could only be defeated by keeping every man focused on his responsibilities. Then, just after midday, one of the guides stopped so abruptly that the entire column nearly walked into him. Ahead, hidden beneath enormous strangler figs, stood something that did not belong in the rainforest. Large stones, perfectly shaped, arranged in a circle. Each block weighed several tons and had clearly been carved by human hands centuries earlier. Moss covered their surfaces, vines wrapped around them, and tree roots had begun swallowing the outer edges. But their deliberate construction remained unmistakable. The stones formed a ring nearly 60 feet across, with a single narrow opening facing east. For several moments, no one spoke. This was exactly the kind of discovery Bennett had dreamed of, evidence that an unknown civilization had once occupied this forgotten region. Photographers immediately unpacked their cameras. Surveyors measured distances between the stones. The botanists carefully removed vines from several carvings, revealing intricate geometric patterns unlike anything previously documented. Bennett's excitement briefly erased the anxiety that had haunted the expedition since Carter vanished. If these ruins could be properly documented, the journey would already justify itself. Yet something about the site felt wrong. No birds landed within the circle. No insects buzzed through the air. Even the constant sound of the rainforest seemed strangely distant. The silence was so complete that several men instinctively lowered their voices. The physician joked that perhaps the ruins had simply frightened away the wildlife. A few nervous laughs followed, but they faded quickly. While examining one of the larger stones, an engineer noticed a series of shallow grooves carved into its surface. At first they resembled decorative lines, but as more dirt was removed, the pattern became clearer. The grooves connected from stone to stone around the entire circle, forming an enormous design visible only from above. No one understood its purpose. Late that afternoon, Bennett ordered camp to be established nearby. He wanted an entire day to document the site before continuing deeper into the jungle. Some of the guides strongly objected. They argued that spending the night beside the ruins was a mistake. One even refused to pitch his tent inside the clearing, choosing instead to sleep near the edge of the forest despite the greater risk from animals. When Bennett asked why, the guide answered quietly, "Places like this are abandoned for a reason." Again, Bennett thanked him for the warning but refused to alter the plan. Archaeological opportunities of this magnitude were extraordinarily rare. They could not simply walk away because of old legends. As darkness settled over the ruins, an unusual fog drifted between the stones. It was thin at first, then gradually thickened until much of the circle became difficult to see even from a short distance. The guards attributed it to changing temperatures after the afternoon rain, but several admitted they had never seen misbehave quite like this in the jungle. Just after midnight, one of the sentries heard movement, not outside the camp, inside the stone circle. He raised his lantern expecting to see an animal. Instead, he saw a figure standing motionless among the ruins. It appeared to be a man, tall, barefoot, perfectly still. The guard called out. There was no response. Two more men rushed over with rifles and lanterns. For a brief second, All three clearly saw the same silhouette between the ancient stones. Then the fog shifted. The figure was gone. They searched the entire circle before sunrise. There were no footprints, no broken vegetation, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. When Bennett examined the area himself, he concluded the guards had probably mistaken a weathered stone pillar for a person in the shifting lantern light. It was the most reasonable explanation, yet none of the three guards ever changed their story. Each insisted that what they had seen had been watching them first. The expedition left the stone circle shortly after sunrise. Although Bennett never admitted it publicly, he was relieved to put distance between the team and the ancient ruins. The discovery had been extraordinary, but the atmosphere surrounding the site lingered in everyone's mind. Even after hours of marching, conversations kept returning to the same question. If an advanced settlement had once existed there, why had it been abandoned? Disease? War? Famine? Or had the jungle simply reclaimed another forgotten civilization, just as it had swallowed countless others over the centuries? The maps now offered almost no guidance. Every new valley seemed to contradict the previous day's observations. Rivers divided unexpectedly before vanishing beneath dense vegetation. Hills appeared where flat terrain had been expected. Bennett accepted that from this point onward, the expedition would be creating its own map rather than following someone else's. Every mile carried them deeper into territory that had never been accurately recorded. Late in the afternoon, the advanced scouts stopped once again. Another river blocked their path. It was broad, slow-moving, and surprisingly clear, unlike the darker waters they had followed for weeks. Massive trees leaned over both banks, their roots disappearing beneath the current. The river looked ancient, permanent, impossible to overlook, yet it did not exist on any map. Bennett carefully reviewed every chart he carried. Nothing. No tributary. No seasonal channel. No indication that such a river should have been there. The surveyors repeated their measurements. According to every calculation, the expedition should have been standing nearly 5 miles east of their current position. The numbers made no sense. Unable to explain the discrepancy, Bennett ordered camp to be established while a small team searched for a safe crossing. The current proved stronger than it first appeared, forcing the engineers to construct a temporary rope bridge using nearby trees. Progress was slow, but by the following morning, the expedition successfully crossed without losing equipment. Once on the opposite bank, the forest changed almost immediately. The trees grew noticeably larger. The undergrowth became thinner. Sunlight reached the ground more easily, creating long golden shafts between the trunks. For the first time in weeks, walking became easier. Oddly, no one found that comforting. The rainforest had been brutally difficult from the beginning. Suddenly encountering terrain that seemed almost inviting felt unnatural. Even the guides admitted they had never traveled through this section before. Around midday, they found another surprise. An old trail. Unlike the narrow paths made by animals or indigenous hunters, this route was unusually straight and several feet wide. Although partly reclaimed by vegetation, it clearly showed signs of deliberate construction. Stone fragments appeared beneath the soil in places, suggesting the path had once been reinforced long ago. Someone had built it, but who? And where did it lead? Bennett decided to follow it. The decision divided the expedition. Some argued the trail might lead to the civilization responsible for the stone circle. Others worried that abandoning their planned route would make navigation even more difficult. Bennett considered both opinions before making his choice. Exploring unknown features was the very purpose of the expedition. Ignoring such a discovery would contradict everything they had come to accomplish. For nearly 3 hours, the trail continued almost perfectly straight. No forks, no intersections, no signs of recent travelers. Then, without warning, it ended, not gradually, not beneath a landslide. It simply stopped in the middle of the forest. Ahead lay untouched vegetation, as dense as everywhere else. The carefully constructed pathway vanished, as though whoever built it had abandoned the project in a single instant. The engineers examined the ground, expecting to find evidence that erosion or flooding had destroyed the remaining section. There was none. It genuinely appeared as though the trail had never extended beyond that point. Confused but determined, Bennett ordered the team to continue through the untouched vegetation. Less than half an hour later, one of the photographers called everyone over. Hidden beneath centuries of moss stood a weathered stone marker. Its upper half had broken away long ago, but several engraved symbols remained visible. None matched any known language. The markings consisted of repeating geometric shapes arranged in precise rows. The photographer captured dozens of images, while Bennett carefully copied the symbols into his journal. It was another remarkable discovery. Yet something else caught the physician's attention. At the base of the stone, resting beneath fallen leaves, lay a rusted metal compass. It was clearly modern, not ancient. Someone had dropped it there within the last few decades. When Bennett picked it up, he noticed faded initials scratched into the brass casing. They belonged to another scientific expedition, one that had officially disappeared in the same region almost 18 years earlier. Until that moment, everyone had believed those explorers had simply become lost somewhere in the rainforest. Now they knew something far more disturbing. They had reached exactly the same place. And whatever had happened to that expedition had happened here. The discovery of the old compass silenced the expedition. Bennett turned the object over in his hands several times, carefully brushing away the rust with a cloth. The initials were still visible despite years of exposure to rain and humidity. There was no doubt the compass belonged to Morrison Expedition, a scientific mission that had entered the same region nearly 2 decades earlier before disappearing without explanation. Newspapers had reported the search for months. Rescue teams found nothing. Eventually, the expedition became another unsolved mystery buried in forgotten archives. Now, for the first time, there was proof that they had reached this part of the jungle, but only proof that they had arrived. Nothing explained why they had never left. Bennett ordered the compass wrapped in oilcloth and placed inside a locked equipment chest. It would be one of the most important artifacts they carried home. At least, that was what everyone still believed. The team resumed marching along the faint direction suggested by the old trail. The vegetation thickened again, forcing the men to reopen a path with machetes. Progress slowed to less than a mile every few hours. The humidity became almost unbearable, and dark clouds gathered overhead once more, threatening another tropical storm. Just before sunset, one of the guides raised his hand. Smoke, very faint, barely visible through the trees. Every man froze. If someone had lit a fire, then either another expedition was nearby or an isolated community lived ahead. Bennett ordered complete silence. The column advanced cautiously, rifles lower but ready, carefully avoiding unnecessary noise. The smoke grew stronger with every step. Then they found its source. An abandoned campsite. Not ancient, not indigenous. Modern. The remains of canvas tents still stood between several trees, though the fabric had rotted away in large sections. Wooden crates lay scattered across the clearing, their lids broken open. Metal cooking pots rested beside a fire pit, filled with ash that had long since turned gray. Several folding chairs had collapsed where they stood. Rainwater collected inside rusted fuel cans. Everything suggested that whoever had occupied the camp had left in extraordinary haste, or had never been able to leave at all. The expedition spread through the clearing, documenting every detail. One crate still contained unopened tins of preserved food, swollen with age but untouched. Another held scientific instruments remarkably similar to their own. Near one tent, the physician discovered a leather medical bag with several glass bottles still inside. Each item carried the faded initials of the Morrison Expedition. The realization settled over the camp like a heavy weight. They were standing inside the final known location of the missing explorers. One of the photographers found something even more remarkable. A journal. Its leather cover had hardened with age, but many of the pages remained readable. Bennett carefully opened it, handling each sheet as though it might crumble apart. Much of the writing had been damaged by moisture, yet enough survived to reconstruct portions of the expedition's final days. The earliest entries described ordinary scientific work, river crossings, botanical collections, weather conditions, and encounters with wildlife. But as the pages progressed, the tone gradually changed. Navigation problems, strange sounds after dark, growing disagreements among the team. Several references to members becoming convinced they were being followed. One sentence, written in noticeably shaky handwriting, caught everyone's attention. The forest no longer behaves the same during the day. Further ahead, another page contained only a single line. We keep return to places we already left. No explanation followed. Several later pages had been torn out entirely. No one knew by whom. As darkness approached, Bennett faced a difficult decision. Continuing through unfamiliar terrain at night would be dangerous. Remaining inside the abandoned camp felt equally unsettling. After a brief discussion, he chose the practical option. They would stay until dawn, document everything thoroughly, and continue first thing in the morning. The men pitched their tents beside those left behind by the Morrison expedition. Few of them slept well. Shortly after midnight, the radio operator, who had volunteered for first watch, noticed something unusual. One of the old tents was moving, not from the wind. The canvas shifted gently from inside, as though someone had quietly changed position. Certain that an animal had entered, he approached with his lantern. The movement stopped. He pulled aside the torn canvas. The tent was empty. Nothing inside except a rusted cot and a blanket nearly consumed by mold. He searched beneath it. Nothing. Shaking his head, he stepped back outside. As he lowered the lantern, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh footprints. Bare feet. They began at the entrance of the empty tent, crossed the muddy clearing, and disappeared just before reaching Bennett's tent. No one slept after the discovery of the footprints. The clearing remained illuminated by lanterns until sunrise, while every member of the expedition searched the abandoned camp once again. The fresh tracks clearly belonged to an adult. They crossed the mud with perfect definition, proving they had been made only minutes before they were discovered. Yet, just as had happened several times already, they ended abruptly without leading anywhere. Bennett knelt beside the final print for several moments. He measured its length, its depth, the distance between each step. Everything appeared completely normal, except for one detail. The right footprint showed a slight limp, as though whoever had made it carried an old injury. He carefully noted the observation in his journal before ordering breakfast. The men obeyed in silence. Their conversations had become practical and brief. No one spoke about strange figures, disappearing trails, or legends anymore. Those subjects no longer felt like stories. They had become part of daily life. After eating, Bennett returned to the weather journal recovered from the abandoned camp. He hoped daylight would make the damaged pages easier to read. Using a small brush, he gently removed dirt and mold while the photographer documented each sheet before further deterioration could occur. Several pages that seemed unreadable during the night slowly revealed faded words beneath the stains. The entries covered the Morrison expedition's final week. At first, the problem sounded familiar. Compasses behaving unpredictably, maps becoming unreliable, several men insisting they recognized places they had never visited. Then the notes grew increasingly disturbing. Thomas claims we crossed this river yesterday. There is no river on yesterday's map. We found our own footprints ahead of us. Bennett stopped reading. He looked up at the surveyors. No one spoke. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Every strange event described by the previous expedition mirrored experiences they themselves had already encountered. The physician quietly suggested that stress and isolation often produce similar psychological effects in different groups. It was a reasonable explanation, but it failed to explain the abandoned camp, or the compass, or the footprints. Bennett continued reading. One paragraph had been written with such force that the pencil nearly tore through the paper. We are no longer certain which direction is home. Several pages later came another sentence. We should have turned back after the stone circle. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Neither Bennett nor anyone else had mentioned the stone circle to the Morrison expedition. The journal should not have known about it. The final surviving page was badly damaged. Nearly half the writing had disappeared beneath water stains. Only fragments remained. If anyone finds this, do not. The forest. It remembers. The sentence ended there. The remaining pages had been deliberately removed, not rotted away. Cut out. Whoever had torn them from the journal had taken only the final section, perhaps the explanation, perhaps the ending, perhaps the warning. No one would ever know. That afternoon, the expedition carefully packed every artifact recovered from the abandoned camp. Bennett decided they had spent enough time there. Whatever answers remained hidden in the clearing had either vanished with the missing explorers or been carried away long before their arrival. As the men prepared to leave, one of the engineers noticed something unusual near the edge of the camp. A tree. Its bark had been cut with a knife. At first the marks appeared random. Then he realized they formed letters. Initials, dates, names. At least 12 different explorers had carved their identities into the trunk over many years. Some belonged to members of the Morrison expedition. Others matched no known records. But one inscription had clearly been made much more recently. The wood was still pale where the bark had been removed. The carving read only 3 words. Don't follow me. There was no name, no date, nothing else. Bennett studied the message for several long seconds before quietly ordering the column to move. No one argued. No one looked back. Yet after nearly an hour of marching, one of the younger botanists suddenly frowned. He had an excellent memory. He was certain of it. The enormous kapok tree they had just passed looked exactly like the one bearing the warning. He said nothing, because he knew how impossible that sounded. Then, 15 minutes later, the expedition emerged into another small clearing. Standing at its center was the same tree, with the same initials, the same scars, and the same 3 words carved into its trunk. Don't follow me. The clearing fell silent. No one needed to compare the carvings or inspect the bark more closely. Every man recognized the tree immediately. The twisted roots, the broken branch hanging over one side, the deep scar running down the trunk, and the freshly carved warning were identical. Somehow, despite walking in what they believed had been a straight line for more than an hour, the expedition had arrived back at exactly the same place. Bennett refused to accept the obvious conclusion. He immediately blamed an error in navigation. Dense forests often distorted a person's sense of direction, even for experienced explorers. If the team had unknowingly drifted several degrees to one side over many miles, it was entirely possible they had completed a large circle without realizing it. The explanation sounded reasonable, until the surveyors objected. Throughout the march, they had been taking compass bearings every few hundred yards. Distances had been measured. Landmarks had been recorded. According to every instrument they carried, the expedition had traveled almost due west. Returning to the same tree should have been impossible. Determined to eliminate every possibility, Bennett designed a simple experiment. A bright red cloth was tied high around the trunk. The exact location was sketched. A compass bearing was recorded. Then the expedition deliberately marched east instead of west. No one spoke during the journey. Every man silently watched the forest, trying to notice anything that might explain what had happened. 3 hours passed. The terrain changed repeatedly. They crossed 2 narrow streams, climbed a rocky slope, descended into a shallow valley. Not once did anyone recognize the surroundings. Confidence slowly returned. Perhaps the first incident had truly been nothing more than an unfortunate navigational mistake. Then the lead guide stopped. Ahead, wrapped around a tree nearly 20 feet above the ground, fluttered a strip of bright red cloth. No one moved. It was impossible. They had approached from the opposite direction. The valley behind them had not existed during the previous march. The streams were different. The elevation was different. Yet, somehow, they had reached the marked tree again. One by one, the men walked toward it. The knot was exactly the one they had tied. Bennett checked the bark. The warning remained. Don't follow me. For the first time since the expedition began, he found himself without an explanation. No one suggested continuing immediately. Even the strongest supporters of the mission now looked toward him, waiting for guidance. Finally, Bennett ordered camp to be established right there in the clearing. Not because he wanted to remain, because he needed time to think. That evening, the atmosphere around the fire was unlike anything the expedition had experienced before. No one discussed discoveries. No one planned tomorrow's route. Several men quietly admitted they wanted to return home immediately. Others argued that they no longer knew which direction home actually was. The physician attempted to calm everyone by proposing a practical theory. Continuous stress, tropical illness, dehydration, and physical exhaustion could impair memory and judgment. If the surveyors had unknowingly recorded incorrect bearings earlier in the journey, every navigation decision since then might have been based on flawed assumptions. It was the most rational explanation offered so far, but it depended on every experienced navigator making exactly the same mistake for several consecutive days. Late that night, Bennett remained awake inside his tent studying every page of his journal. The numbers, the sketches, the river crossings, the compass bearings. Everything appeared internally consistent. Nothing suggested they had become hopelessly lost, yet reality refused to match the records. As he turned another page, a folded sheet slipped from between his notes. He frowned. He did not remember placing it there. The paper was old, far older than the notebook itself. Its edges had darkened with age. Across the center, written in faded pencil, was a single sentence. If you're reading this, you're already too far in. Bennett stared at the handwriting. It wasn't his. He was certain of that. He quietly compared it to the recovered journal from the Morrison expedition. The letters matched perfectly. Someone, at some point, had placed one of Morrison's missing pages. Inside Bennett's own notebook, he searched every pocket, every document case, every map. Nothing else had been disturbed, only that single page. Slowly, he looked toward the entrance of his tent. The flap remained closed. Outside, the camp was silent, too silent. Then, very softly, from somewhere beyond the firelight, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not running, not approaching quickly, just walking, slowly, circling the camp, one careful step after another. No one reacted immediately to the footsteps around the dying campfire. Every man remained perfectly still, listening. The sound was faint but unmistakable. A slow, deliberate rhythm circled the clearing beyond the reach of the lanterns. Whoever, or whatever, was making it never stepped into the light. The guards raised their rifles, but Bennett motioned for them to hold their position. Firing blindly into the darkness would only waste ammunition and invite panic. The footsteps continued, always the same pace, never faster, never closer. For nearly 20 minutes, the unseen presence moved around the camp before the sound gradually faded into the forest. No branches snapped, no voices were heard. Eventually, only the distant chorus of insects returned. When dawn arrived, the guard searched the perimeter, expecting to find tracks. There were none. Not even the soft mud surrounding the clearing showed signs that anyone had walked there during the night. The absence of evidence disturbed the men more than footprints would have. If someone had circled the camp, there should have been marks. If there were no marks, what had they heard? Bennett ordered the expedition to continue moving. Remaining in one place would solve nothing. Before leaving, however, he instructed every man to count supplies personally. Food, ammunition, medical equipment, and navigation instruments were carefully inspected. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been moved. It was as though the visitor had wanted only one thing: to let them know they were not alone. By midday, a thin mist began settling between the enormous trees despite the warm weather. Visibility gradually shortened until distant figures became little more than shadows drifting through pale gray light. Bennett ordered the men to reduce the distance between one another. Nobody was to lose sight of the person walking ahead. The column advanced slowly. Every few minutes, someone called out to confirm everyone was still present. 22 voices answered. Samuel Carter's disappearance had permanently changed the routine. Late that afternoon, the rear guard reported movement behind the expedition. At first, they assumed it was another member of the team. Then they realized something impossible. The figure remained the same distance away no matter how fast they walked. It never approached. It never fell behind. It simply followed. Bennett and 2 guides carefully moved back through the line until they could see it themselves. There, between the trees, partially hidden by drifting mist, stood a man. He wore faded expedition clothing. His posture was perfectly upright. One arm hung strangely at his side. He made no attempt to hide, nor did he move. Bennett raised a hand and shouted. No answer. One of the guides called out in a local language. Silence. After several seconds, Bennett decided to approach. He advanced cautiously with two armed companions while the rest of the expedition remained where they were. The figure did not react. 30 yards. 20. 15. Then a curtain of mist drifted between them for only a moment. When it cleared, the man was gone. The ground beneath the trees was soft from recent rain. There should have been footprints. There were none, only fallen leaves. The physician insisted they had likely mistaken a broken tree trunk for a person through the shifting fog. No one argued, yet no one believed him either. As evening approached, another discovery deepened the mystery. One of the botanists noticed several deep cuts carved into a massive cedar tree. Unlike the initials found earlier, these marks formed vertical lines grouped in sets of 5. Bennett counted them carefully. 37 groups. One incomplete set. 188 marks in total. Someone had stood beside that tree, keeping track of time. 1 mark for each day, more than 6 months. The cuts appeared weathered but unmistakably deliberate. Nearby, beneath a thick layer of leaves, the engineers uncovered the remains of a crude shelter built from branches and vines. It had collapsed long ago. Inside lay the rusted frame of a folding bed, fragment of cooking utensils, and a single enamel cup. Nothing else. Whoever had lived there had survived alone for months, or tried to. As Bennett examined the shelter, he noticed faint writing scratched into the metal cup. He cleaned away the dirt with his sleeve. 3 words slowly appeared. Don't trust him. No name. No explanation. Only another warning. The expedition stared at one another in complete silence. Who was him? One of the missing explorers? Someone still living in the forest? Or the only man who would eventually make it back? The discovery of the shelter marked a turning point. Until then, the expedition had believed they were following the traces of men who had disappeared years earlier. Now it became clear that at least one person had survived in the jungle for months after the Morrison expedition vanished. The tally marks carved into the cedar tree proved it. Someone had counted each passing day with remarkable discipline before, for reasons unknown, abandoning the shelter forever. Bennett carefully documented every detail. The shelter's dimensions, the direction it faced, the position of the fire pit, even the arrangement of the stones surrounding it. If they managed to return home, these records would become invaluable. But as he wrote, he noticed something unsettling. His own handwriting had changed. The neat, precise lettering that had filled his journals for years now appeared uneven and hurried. At first he blamed fatigue. His hands had been shaking slightly since Carter disappeared, and weeks of humidity had swollen the paper beneath his pencil. Yet the change felt more profound than that. It was as though he no longer trusted his own observations enough to write them confidently. The team resumed marching shortly after noon. An unusual tension followed them through the trees. No one laughed anymore. Even ordinary conversations faded quickly. Every sound in the forest seemed louder than before. Every shadow lingered a little longer. As afternoon turned to evening, one of the youngest members of the expedition, botanist Daniel Hayes, began acting strangely. Normally calm and methodical, Hayes repeatedly stopped to look behind the group. At first the others assumed he was simply frightened, but his behavior gradually became impossible to ignore. He whispered to himself, paused without explanation, occasionally smiled toward empty sections of the forest. When Bennett finally asked if he was feeling ill, Hayes hesitated before answering. I think someone keeps calling my name. The physician immediately examined him. His temperature was normal. No obvious signs of malaria. No serious dehydration. Only exhaustion. The doctor suggested a full night's rest and instructed the others to keep Hayes close until morning. Hayes agreed, or at least, he appeared to. That night, camp was established beside a shallow stream. The tents formed a tight circle. Extra guards were posted. No fires were allowed beyond the central campfire. Bennett wanted everyone within sight of one another. For several hours, everything remained peaceful. Then, sometime after midnight, a scream shattered the silence. The entire camp sprang awake. Lanterns flared to life. Rifles were raised. The sound had come from Hayes' tent. Several men rushed inside expecting to find him under attack. The tent was empty. Its rear flap had been cut open from the inside. Fresh footprints led away into the darkness. For the first time since entering the jungle, there was an actual trail to follow. Bennett immediately organized a pursuit. The tracks were unmistakably Hayes. Bare feet, running, occasionally stumbling. Branches snapped ahead, suggesting he could not be far away. The men followed for nearly 15 minutes before hearing voices. One voice. Hayes. He was speaking rapidly to someone. Relieved, Bennett shouted his name. The talking stopped instantly. The search party hurried forward. Moments later, they found him standing alone in a small clearing. His back faced the expedition. He remained perfectly still. Daniel. Bennett called gently. No response. Two men approached and carefully placed their hands on his shoulders. Hayes slowly turned around. His expression was blank. Not frightened. Not confused. Simply empty. After several long seconds, he spoke. Why did you interrupt us? Bennett glanced around the clearing. There isn't anyone else here. Hayes frowned. Of course there is. He pointed toward a large tree. They've been waiting for us since before we arrived. No one stood there. The physician quietly led Hayes back toward camp. He offered no resistance. The following morning, Hayes remembered almost nothing. He admitted hearing voices during the previous evening, but insisted they had sounded familiar, not threatening, comforting, like old friends inviting him to follow them. He could not explain why he had left the tent. He simply believed someone he trusted had been calling. The physician gathered Bennett privately. His opinion was becoming increasingly serious. Continuous stress, isolation, poor nutrition, tropical humidity, and relentless psychological pressure were beginning to affect the men. If one expedition member had already started hearing voices, others might soon experience the same thing. Bennett listened without interrupting. Then he looked toward the dense wall of forest surrounding the camp. For the first time, he quietly asked a question he had avoided since the expedition began. What if it isn't only exhaustion? The question lingered in Bennett's mind long after the conversation ended. For weeks, he had insisted that every strange event could eventually be explained through science, geography, or human error. That conviction had guided every decision since leaving civilization. But the expedition was no longer confronting isolated incidents. They had discovered the abandoned camp of another missing expedition, impossible footprints, a journal describing the same experiences they were now living, a mysterious survivor shelter, and a young botanist who had wandered into the darkness believing invisible voices were calling him. Still, there was only one way forward. The expedition resumed its march shortly after sunrise. The terrain gradually rose into a series of rocky hills unlike anything they had encountered before. Massive boulders emerged from the forest floor, forcing the men to climb rather than cut through vegetation. The trees became less dense, allowing wider views across the surrounding canopy. For the first time in days, the surveyors were able to identify distant landmarks and confidently estimate their elevation. Late that afternoon, the lead guide suddenly froze. He slowly raised one hand toward the horizon. No one spoke. Beyond the treetops, partially hidden by vines and centuries of vegetation, something reflected the fading sunlight. Stone, not natural rock. Walls. The expedition hurried toward higher ground. As they reached the crest of a ridge, the entire valley opened before them. Every man stopped walking. Stretching across the jungle floor lay the remains of an enormous ancient settlement. Wide stone terraces disappeared beneath giant trees. Broken staircases climbed hillsides before ending in collapsed temples. Long avenues could still be traced beneath the canopy, connecting dozens of weathered structures scattered across the valley. Towering pillars leaned at impossible angles, wrapped by roots thicker than a man's body. Nature had not merely surrounded the city, it had consumed it. For several minutes, no one remembered to speak. Bennett slowly removed his hat. His lifelong dream stood before him. Not a myth, not a legend, an actual lost city. The photographers immediately began documenting the panorama, while surveyors estimated its dimensions. Even from their elevated position, the ruins extended far beyond what they could fully observe. It was unlike any archaeological site previously recorded in that region. Every hardship suddenly seemed worthwhile. Every mile, every storm, every sacrifice. History would remember this discovery forever. Descending into the valley took nearly 2 hours. As the expedition approached the first structures, the extraordinary scale became even clearer. The stone blocks had been cut with astonishing precision. Massive staircases still stood despite centuries of erosion. Elaborate carvings decorated walls that had somehow resisted complete destruction beneath the relentless rainforest. Yet something felt deeply unsettling. The city showed remarkably little evidence of violence. There were no collapsed defensive walls, no burn marks, no obvious signs of invasion. It appeared abandoned, as though its inhabitants had simply walked away. Bennett assigned teams to different sections of the ruins. One group documented architecture, another searched for inscriptions. The botanists collected samples growing directly from the ancient masonry. Everything proceeded with disciplined excitement, until one of the engineers shouted for Bennett. Inside a partially collapsed building, they had discovered human skeletons. Not one, not dozens, hundreds. The remains lay exactly where people might have lived ordinary lives. Some sat against walls. Others remained inside collapsed rooms. Several still clutched pottery or tools. There were no visible injuries, no signs of battle, no weapons scattered across the floor. It looked as though an entire population had simply stopped. The physician examined several skeletons. He found no immediate evidence of disease or trauma. Nothing explained why so many people had died where they stood. Then came another discovery. Near the center of the city stood a large stone platform. Unlike the surrounding ruins, it remained almost perfectly preserved. Its surface had been polished smooth. At its center rested a massive circular carving, remarkably similar to the pattern they had seen weeks earlier inside the mysterious stone circle. The designs matched. Exactly. The stone circle had not been an isolated monument. It had been connected to the city, perhaps built by the same civilization, perhaps serving the same unknown purpose. As Bennett carefully sketched the platform, one of the guides quietly refused to step onto it. Another crossed himself before backing away. When Bennett asked why, the oldest guide answered in a voice barely above a whisper. "This," he looked around the silent ruins, "is the place our grandfathers warned us about." Bennett asked the obvious question. "What happened here?" The guide stared at the empty city for several seconds before replying. "They never left." Bennett frowned. "They're only skeletons." The guide slowly shook his head. Without taking his eyes off the ruins, he whispered words that would haunt the expedition for the rest of its journey. "No. The skeletons are the ones who escaped." The guide's words lingered in the air long after he fell silent. No one challenged him. The men simply looked around the abandoned city with new eyes. Until that moment, they had seen only one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the century. Now, despite every effort to remain rational, many found themselves wondering whether the ruins were more than the remains of forgotten civilization. The complete absence of evidence made the place feel strangely alive. There were no signs of war, no burned buildings, no mass graves created in haste. It was as though an entire society had simply stopped existing between one ordinary day and the next. Bennett forced everyone back to work. Measurements were taken. Buildings were numbered. Sketches filled page after page of the expedition journals. The familiar rhythm of scientific observation slowly restored a sense of purpose. Facts were easier to trust than fear. Near the center of the city, several engineers began examining the enormous circular platform. Its polished surface showed almost no weathering compared to the surrounding ruins. The stone itself appeared unusually hard, resisting even the steel tips of their tools. Around its edge, shallow channels formed the same geometric design they had already documented at the isolated stone circle weeks earlier. As one engineer tapped the surface with the handle of his hammer, something unexpected happened. The sound changed. Most of the platform produced a solid, heavy echo. One section did not. It sounded hollow. The team immediately cleared away centuries of moss and packed soil. Working carefully with chisels and wooden wedges, they managed to lift a perfectly fitted stone slab hidden near the center of the platform. Beneath it lay a narrow chamber, only 3 feet deep, completely dry. Inside rested a small stone box sealed with hardened tree resin that had somehow survived countless rainy seasons. No one spoke as Bennett carefully broke the ancient seal. The lid lifted slowly. The box contained no gold, no jewels, no ceremonial objects, only a bundle of thin stone tablets, stacked one above another. Each tablet was covered with finely carved symbols unlike any writing system known to the expedition. The archaeologists stared in amazement. If the inscriptions could ever be translated, they might reveal the history of the civilization that built the city, or explain why it vanished. The photographer spent hours documenting every surface before the tablets were wrapped individually for transport. Then something even more surprising emerged. Beneath the final tablet, hidden against the bottom of the box, lay a folded piece of paper. Modern paper, not ancient. Every man immediately recognized it. It belonged to the Morrison expedition. The sheet had been protected inside waxcloth, leaving the writing almost perfectly preserved. Bennett unfolded it with trembling hands. Unlike the damaged journal, the message remained completely readable. There was no greeting, no signature, only hurried handwriting filling both sides. If you found this, leave now. We reached the city believing we had made the greatest discovery of our lives. We were wrong. The city is not what traps people. It only marks where it begins. Do not spend another night here. We ignored the warnings. We thought we understood the pattern. We thought we could map it. We were already lost before we realized we had stopped moving. The writing became increasingly rushed. The jungle changes. It does not move around you. It moves you. Bennett slowly turned the page. Only 3 lines remained. If one of us returns, do not believe everything he says. He won't know he stayed. Silence settled over the chamber. Even Bennett could not immediately find words. The physician quietly reread the final sentence several times. He won't know he stayed. What could that possibly mean? One of the younger surveyors suggested the missing explorers had simply descended into paranoia after months of isolation. Another argued the writer had probably been suffering from fever. Both explanations sounded reasonable, yet neither explained why the warning had been hidden beneath the ancient platform instead of carried away. As evening approached, Bennett faced another difficult decision. Leaving immediately meant abandoning the opportunity to study one of the greatest archaeological discoveries imaginable. Remaining until morning meant ignoring the final written warning left by the last expedition known to have reached the city. For several minutes, he stood alone beside the platform, staring across the silent ruins. His entire career had prepared him to seek answers. Walking away without understanding the city felt impossible. Finally, he made his decision. The expedition would remain. Just one more night. It was the same decision the Morrison expedition had made. As darkness fell over the city, the expedition seemed to have entered another world. During the day, the ruins conveyed the feeling of a civilization forgotten by history. At night, however, the silence made the place almost oppressive. There was no constant chorus of insects that had accompanied the forest since the beginning of the journey, nor the distant calls of birds or monkeys. The air remained heavy, still, as if all life around had retreated away from that valley. Bennett ordered that the camp be set up in the center of the old main square, where he believed visibility would be greater and any approach could be noticed in advance. The tents formed a compact circle, lanterns were positioned around the perimeter, and everyone was instructed to stay close together throughout the night. Despite their accumulated fatigue, few managed to sleep. Some observed the enormous buildings partially illuminated by the moon. Try to imagine what that place had been like centuries before. Others reread the notes they had made throughout the day, comparing symbols, drawings, and measurements. Bennett spent hours studying again the message found inside the stone box. The more he read, the more one phrase bothered him. The city is not what holds people captive. It merely marks where everything begins. That sentence seemed written by someone completely lucid. There were no signs of delirium or despair. It was an objective, almost scientific warning. Even so, he still believed that there was a rational explanation that simply had not yet been discovered. Shortly after midnight, a metallic noise broke the silence. It sounded like stone scraping against stone. The guards quickly illuminated the direction of the noise, but found no one. A few minutes later, the same noise was heard again, this time coming from the opposite side of the square. Then another. Within minutes, similar sound began to echo through different parts of the ruins, always spaced out, always brief, as if enormous blocks of stone were slowly moving somewhere in the city. The men remained motionless, tried to identify the exact source, but the acoustics of the valley made the sound seem to come from all sides at once. Bennett decided to personally inspect one of the nearby buildings, accompanied by 2 engineers and one of the guides. They walked a few meters beyond the main square when they noticed something strange. During the day, the entrance to that building had remained completely blocked by a large fallen column. Now, the passage was clear. The column was still in place, but leaning a few meters to the side, as if it had been moved recently. None of them believed that 4 men would be able to move a stone of that size, much less without leaving any mark on the ground. The group slowly entered the structure. The interior remained dry despite the constant humidity of the forest. New reliefs appeared on the walls, seemingly absent during the previous inspection. Lanterns illuminated human figures walking in long lines, always heading toward the center of a large circle carved in stone. In another panel, the same people appeared to try to return, but their paths repeatedly bent, leading them back to the same starting point. Bennett brought the lantern closer and realized that this was not merely decorative art. It seemed to represent some idea extremely important to that civilization. While copying some of the drawings into his notebook, one of the engineers caught his attention. On the floor were recent footprints covered only by a thin layer of dust. They were modern boots, not bare feet like those found previously. Bennett immediately knelt down. The pattern of the sole was identical to that used by the Morrison expedition almost 20 years before. The footprints entered the building, ran across the entire room, and disappeared before a completely smooth wall. There was no hidden door, secret passage, or tunnel, just solid stone. Upon returning to camp, they found everyone awake. Several team members claimed to have seen small lights moving slowly between the more distant buildings. They weren't ordinary flashlights. They looked like faint points of light that appeared for a few seconds and then disappeared again behind the buildings. The photographer insisted he had managed to capture one of them. When he quickly developed a plate using his portable equipment, the image showed only empty ruins. No light, no people. Only one unexpected detail caught Bennett's attention. At the top of the staircase, where no one remembered seeing any figure during the exposure of the photograph, a man appeared standing looking directly at the camera. The image was blurry, but enough to reveal explorers' clothing, a campaign hat, and a backpack similar to those used by the Morrison expedition. Bennett compared the portrait with the official photograph of that group found years earlier in the archives of the Geographical Society. The face was practically the same. Era Thomas Morrison, the leader of the missing expedition. The man had been officially declared dead for almost 20 years. And in the photograph taken a few minutes earlier, he didn't look like a skeleton. It seemed like he was just waiting for someone. Dawn brought a brief respite, but no answers. Bennett gathered the entire team and forbade any comment on the photograph until he could analyze it calmly. The goal was to prevent the fear from spreading further. The image was examined from different angles, using a magnifying glass. The man appeared distant, partially obscured by the shadow of the staircase, but enough details remained visible. The hat, the backpack, the posture, and even the strap across his chest matched the equipment used by the Morrison expedition. The photographer swore that that point on the staircase was completely empty when the photo was taken. No one could explain how a figure had appeared only on the negative. Even shaken, the researchers decided to complete their survey of the city before beginning their return. If they had truly found an unknown civilization, abandoning the site without recording as much information as possible would be wasting a historic discovery. Throughout the morning, small teams traversed ancient streets, partially buried temples, and residences overtaken by roots. In practically all of them, they found the same pattern. Everyday objects abandoned exactly where they had been left. Tools on workbenches, ceramic containers, stone instruments, and even children's toys remained scattered as if their owners intended to return a few hours later. Shortly before noon, one of the engineers found a hidden staircase beneath a gigantic fig tree. It descended several meters to a narrow corridor carved into the rock. Bennett gathered a small group and began the descent. The air immediately became colder and drier. The walls were covered with the same symbols seen on the stone tablets, but in greater quantity. The corridor ended in a circular chamber containing only a stone bench and a narrow opening facing the ceiling. It seemed a place intended for observation or meditation. On the floor, however, there was something completely unexpected. A modern backpack. The leather was aged but still intact. Inside, they found a metal canteen, a broken compass, a rusty revolver, and a small notebook protected by several layers of wax cloth. On the cover appeared a familiar name, Thomas Morrison. Upon opening the first pages, Bennett realized it was a personal diary of the leader of the missing expedition. Unlike the other notebook found earlier, this one was almost intact. The notes typically began by describing the excitement of discovering the city and the expectation of staying there for only a few days. However, as the entries progressed, the text became increasingly unsettling. Morrison wrote that maps ceased to make sense after a while, that seemingly simple trails always led to the same places, and that several men swore they had walked all day only to find themselves standing before the same building again. Initially, he believed it was human error. Then he began to suspect that the environment itself caused some kind of immeasurable disorientation. In the final pages, his writing became surprisingly clear, almost serene. Morrison asserted that he had finally understood the mistake made by all previous expeditions. They believed they were lost in space when, in fact, they were lost in time. According to him, the forest didn't alter mountains or rivers. It altered people's perception of how far they had walked, how much time had passed, and where they had actually come from. Days seemed like hours. Hours seemed like weeks. Men would separate for only a few minutes and return convinced they had been alone for entire days. Bennett slowly closed the diary. That theory seemed absurd, but it explained many events experienced by his own team. Before he could reflect more deeply, he heard footsteps coming from a hallway. Everyone raised their lanterns. A man slowly appeared in the doorway of the chamber. He was extremely thin. His beard reached his chest. His clothes, though almost destroyed, resembled an old explorer's uniform. His completely white hair contrasted with a face marked by sun and malnutrition. For several seconds, no one dared to say a word. It was a stranger who broke the silence. In a weak voice, almost a whisper, he asked, "Did you arrive yesterday or many years ago?" Bennett stepped forward. "Who are you?" The man stared at everyone as if trying to recognize faces forgotten for decades. Finally, he replied, "My name is Thomas Morrison. The leader of a missing expedition was alive. Or at least, that was exactly what he believed." Chapter 16 completed. For a few seconds, no one could react. Bennett intently observed the man before him, tried to reconcile his aged appearance with the photographs he had seen before the expedition. Despite the long beard, the extremely thin body, and the deep scars on his face, there were enough similarities to make it impossible to ignore the possibility that he really was Thomas Morrison. The doctor approached slowly, examining his eyes, his breathing, and the general state of his body. He was malnourished, dehydrated, and clearly weakened, but alive. They carried him carefully to the camp, where he received water and small portions of food to avoid shocking his body. Morrison ate slowly, like someone who had learned to conserve every movement. For a long time he remained silent, observing the members of the expedition with a mixture of curiosity and sadness. He seemed to recognize in them the same confidence he himself had carried when he entered that forest many years before. Late in the afternoon, Bennett finally asked the question everyone had been waiting for. "What happened to your expedition?" Morrison stood looking at the city for a few moments before answering. According to him, everything started exactly as it had happened with Bennett's team. First came the navigation errors. Then, the constant feeling of walking without really making progress. Next came the voices, the inexplicable footprints, and the impression that someone was watching the group's every move. No one believed their companions' stories, as each man witnessed slightly different events. Gradually, they stopped trusting each other. The days became impossible to count. The clocks kept ticking, but no one could agree on how much time had passed. Some swore, They had only been in the forest for a few weeks. Others were certain that entire months had gone by. Arguments intensified. Discipline disappeared, and small groups began searching for a way out on their own, convinced that the others were choosing the wrong path. That's when the first deaths occurred. Not because of animal attacks, not even because of illnesses. The men simply disappeared. Some would go out to fetch water and never be seen again. Others would walk a few meters behind the column and stop responding when called. Morrison said that for a long time he believed they were all still alive somewhere in the forest, trapped in the same invisible labyrinth. Bennett asked why he had never been able to return. The answer came immediately. Because I always thought I was almost there. According to Morrison, the forest fostered a constant illusion of proximity. Every day new signs emerged that the way out was just ahead. A familiar river, a seemingly familiar mountain, a stretch of trail that appeared to lead back to the beginning of the journey. There was always a reason to walk a few more hours. One more day, one more attempt. When he realized he was lost again, it was too late to find his way back. At one point, Bennett showed him the diary found in the underground chamber. Morrison slowly flipped through the pages. His gaze became confused. He didn't remember writing most of those notes. She recognized her own handwriting. I recognized the notebook, but several passages seemed completely foreign to him. Upon reaching the last page, he remained silent for several minutes. Then he closed the diary. So, I finally understand. Bennett frowned. Did you understand what? Morrison took a deep breath before answering. I've never been trying to leave. Everyone stared at him, bewildered. I spent all these years trying to get back to the city because I believed that this was where the way out began. None of the men answered. The sentence seemed absurd, but it perfectly matched the last warning left in her diary. He won't know he stayed. As night fell, Morrison made one last request. He said he would leave with the expedition at dawn, but he set only one condition. When they reached the edge of the city, no one should look back. Never, regardless of what they heard, or what they believed they had seen. Before sunrise, the expedition broke camp for the last time. No one questioned the decision to leave. The discovery of the city was already enough to secure a place in history. But remaining there any longer meant defying all the warnings left by those who never managed to return. Bennett gathered the men and explained the plan clearly. They would walk together, maintain visual contact at all times, and no one, under any circumstances, would stray from the column. The most important rule, however, came from Thomas Morrison. When they reached the old trail leading out of the city, no one should look back, no matter what sound they heard during the walk. The first few kilometers passed in complete silence. Morrison led the group with surprising confidence, as if he knew every curve of the terrain. Several times he changed direction without consulting maps or compasses, completely ignoring the instruments that for weeks had confused all attempts at navigation. Bennett noticed that the old explorer never looked at the horizon. He walked only looking at the ground, identifying small stones, roots, and trees marked almost imperceptibly by time. Hours later, when they believed they had finally left the ruins behind, they began to hear voices coming from the forest. They were faint, familiar, and incredibly convincing. Some swore they heard relatives calling their names. Others recognized companions who had disappeared during the expedition. Daniel Hayes claimed to have clearly heard Samuel Carter calling for help a few meters behind the pillar. The doctor gripped his arm tightly, reminding him of the promise made before their departure. They continued walking. The voices grew more insistent. Then came footsteps. Then the sound of someone running through the trees. One of the engineers began to cry quietly upon hearing his wife's voice calling him by the nickname only she knew. Bennett also heard something. For a few seconds he was absolutely certain that his father, who had died years before, was calmly calling him by name. His natural impulse was to turn his head away. Instead, he pressed the diary against his chest and kept walking. Morrison never slowed down. He just kept repeating the same phrase in a low voice. Keep walking. Don't pay attention. Keep walking. After almost 2 hours, the voices suddenly ceased. The silence returned so quickly it seemed unreal. A few minutes later, the group reached a small river. Morrison smiled for the first time since he had been found. Now we can cross. Bennett looked around and immediately recognized the place. It was the same river where weeks before they had found the first indigenous village. They were, at last, out of the unknown region. Upon arriving at the village, the residents froze at the sight of Morrison. Some elderly people made the sign of the cross. Others simply lowered their heads. One old man approached slowly, observed the old explorer for a few seconds, and asked how long he believed he had been missing. Morrison replied without hesitation, "A few months." The old man remained silent. Then he pointed to a calendar hanging on the wall of a small chapel. Almost 20 years had passed. Morrison approached slowly. His eyes scanned the dates several times. He tried to do the calculations quietly. He smiled as if he believed it was a joke. Then he looked at Bennett again. "That's wrong." No one answered. The following morning, they began the long journey back to civilization. The news spread quickly. Newspapers published the extraordinary story of the lost city, an explorer found alive after almost 2 decades. Scientists interviewed Bennett for months, while archaeologists organized new expeditions to locate the ruins described in their reports. None of them managed to find them. The maps drawn by Bennett always led to different regions. Rivers seemed to change position. Trails disappeared. Landmarks simply no longer existed. Some researchers even suggested that the city had never existed and that the whole narrative was a consequence of hallucinations caused by tropical diseases. However, there was a problem. The artifacts brought back by the expedition were real. The photographs were real. The stone tablets remained undecipherable. E. Thomas Morrison, that was real too. He lived only a few more years. He never fully recovered his health and never went back into a forest. In every interview, he refused to talk about the city. He would only answer one question. When asked how he had managed to survive alone for so long, he always said the same thing: "I've never survived alone." Then he would end the conversation. Decades later, historians still debate what really happened on that expedition. Some believe that everything can be explained by still unknown natural phenomena. Others argue that the extreme isolation was enough to profoundly alter the explorer's perception. But there is one detail recorded in Bennett's original diary that continues to intrigue researchers to this day. Upon reviewing his notes back in England, he noticed something strange. The list of expedition participants contained 23 names. Although, in the photographs taken on the day of departure, 24 men appeared. The 24th person was never identified. None of the team members remembered who he was and her face. He never appeared in another photograph again.